Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today we are celebrating the legacy of one of cinema's most impactful actors and writers, Robert Shaw. He's known for iconic roles in films like Jaws, The Sting, and From Russia with Love. But joining me is Christopher Shaw Myers, Robert Shaw's nephew and the author of the new book, Robert Shaw, An Actor's Life on the Set of Jaws and Beyond. So with the 50th anniversary of Jaws on the horizon, there's no better time to revisit the legacy of the man who brought the legendary Quint to life. So Christopher, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rick. It's great to be here.
You got it. First of all, let me officially ask, do you want Christopher or Chris? What do you prefer to be called?
Chris.
Chris it is then. That's what we shall do. So, all right. So the first question I have is probably going to be the hardest one you have to answer all day. And it's the most obligatory as well, I think. But tell us what this book is about.
Well, the title of it is Robert Shaw. And the subtitle is An Actor's Life on the Set of Jaws and Beyond. So it's obviously about some behind the scenes information on Jaws and about Robert Shaw, who is my uncle. But beyond, so those are the obvious things. Beyond that, it is a biography, but it is not your traditional biography. I often get bored reading biographies because they are sort of like reading an encyclopedia article about someone. So-and-so was born here. These were their childhood friends. This was their high school teacher, et cetera, et cetera. And that's not what this book is about. This book is basically capturing the family stories that I grew up with. And they tell Robert Shaw's and my mom, his younger sister, their story. They were best friends in life. It tells their story from the early childhood days in Orkney to their teenage years in Cornwall, to their adult years in London. And my mother moved to the United States. So a lot of it takes place in New York, where she often visited Robert because he was always in town for a play or a movie premiere or a meeting with studio executives or whatever it was. And in doing so, in telling these family stories, my goal is not to give a, year by year, event by event detailing of Robert Shaw's life, but to bring him to life along with the people he grew up with and who, shaped his personality, his mother and father, obviously, and his siblings. So, and a lot of the book, I mentioned Orkney and Cornwall. Those are places I've spent quite a bit of time visiting. And, I try to bring them to life as well. So that's what it's about.
I got to say, I love how you approach telling this story. I'm glad you brought up how you decided to write it and not make it a timeline of events, so to speak. And it was, so one thing to know about me is when I get a book that I want to sort of read, I don't do a lot of like reading of the one sheets and stuff that I get like the one paragraph synopsis. And I'm like, all right, I'm just going to stop right there. I'm interested in this. I want to kind of dive in. And then I'll dive into the book and then I let it just kind of unfold to me. So I wasn't really aware of how you wrote it. And when I got through the first chapter, I was like, oh my God, I love this. It was such a unique approach to sort of how to tell the story. And it just, the way you wrote it just felt I felt very much like I was in a story that was just unfolding versus a biography. So kudos to you on that. I loved it. It was fantastic.
Well, thank you, Rick. You hit the nail on the head, and I appreciate your thoughts there.
So I have to ask, what led you to take on the task of writing this biography, and specifically for right now? I mean, obviously there's the 50th anniversary of Jaws that's coming up, but I'm just wondering what sort of led to wanting to tell his story. Was there a specific moment or a memory or a discovery that you made that just made you know right now the time is right?
To answer your question very specifically, no, there was not. there was not any, one moment where, the clouds parted and the sun shone, and I went, aha. And in fact, I'll take that a step further. When I was, well, first of all, Robert Shaw died when I was 21 years old. So he died, just 3 years after Jaws was released. And all my memories of him are as a child or as a teenager. And I saw him quite a bit because I was the oldest child in my parents' family. And so when my mother started to visit her brother in New York, I mentioned he was always seemed to be in New York, right? Every couple of months or whatnot. She started from the age of 5 until I was, a teenager, taking me along with her for company, basically. And so I sat in restaurants and hotel lobbies, hotel rooms, and just listened to my mom and Robert telling these family stories that is in the book, basically. And the stories come from others in the family as well. And they were just laugh out loud people. Robert Shaw was one of the funniest people you will ever meet. And in fact, I think everybody in that family, he had 4 siblings, are sort of larger than life figures. They walk into a room and you can tell a Shaw has entered the room because everybody sort of stops and starts listening to them. And Robert, perhaps most of all, although sort of the hidden secret in the Shaw clan is that, as interesting as he was, there was one person who had a bigger personality than him in the family, and that was his mother. I call her Mrs. Shaw in the book, and if you've read it, then you've gotten a little taste of what she was like. She could be a terror, but she could make you laugh just as quickly. I never thought of Robert Shaw as anything special as a child, teenager, even as an adult, because he was just my uncle, right? Every family has somebody like a Robert Shaw, whether it's an actor or a writer or the CEO of a company, or just, a crazy uncle who comes in and starts telling stories. And, everybody knows Uncle Charlie, boy, he's so funny. So it was just part of my DNA that he was just my uncle. So I never ever thought of writing about him. I've had a lot of people since the book came out say to me or write to me, I had no idea you were even related to him. It was nothing that I ever, talked about or thought much about, just a member of the family.
Yep.
The book started, the concept for the book started about 10 years ago. And ironically, it didn't start as a book about Robert. I said to my mother when she was in her 80s, you've had a really interesting life. I think, I'd like to, write your story. And when she sort of pushed back and said, nobody will be interested, I pointed out the following. I said, look, you grew up with an alcoholic father who killed himself. Your mother was larger than life. You survived your youth in the rugged hills of the Orkney Islands, northern coast of Scotland, off the northern coast of Scotland. You survived World War II and all the bombs that dropped all around you. You went to Cambridge University, one of the first women to go there. You went to South Africa, met with Nelson Mandela, fought apartheid there when you were in your 20s, raised 7 children in the United States, taught full-time, and sued your employer when you discovered they were paying the men more than the women. And that's pretty interesting by itself. But by the way, Mom, you're Robert Shaw's sister. You knew him. You were his best friend in life. And you knew him better than anyone. And you were on the set of Jaws with him. So she said yes after I sort of pointed all of that out. And I must have spent 100 hours just talking to her about her life and looking at her life and Robert Shaw's life, through her eyes as a child, through her eyes as a teenager, through her eyes as a young woman, and Robert as a young man. And man, that was an eye opener because none of us know our parents. Not really. We
Well,
meet
you
them.
wrote that in the book. You put a line in the book. I actually pulled it out, and I just because it rang so true with me that
Yeah.
we don't know any of our parents. I think the line was, "You were born well after their youth, so
Yeah.
you come along in their life when they're much further along." And I can't tell you how much that resonated with me.
Oh,
So
that's good.
glad you brought that up.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I saw, but I got to see my mom for the first time, because she sort of went back in time in her own mind and started talking about what it was like to be a girl, to be, and Robert to be a boy, and for the two of them to have these aspirations that they were going to conquer the world, right? And that's really the difference between children and young adults and somebody who's now got the stress of family and career and everything didn't go exactly as planned. And, that's when we meet them. So, yeah, so I've tried to tell this story from, very much from what they were like as children, as teenagers, as young adults, and then progressing to the point where, yes, they are now in middle age and they are under stress. And Robert's stress was very different from my mother's. My mother's stress came from lack of money, right? She didn't have that fabulous career that Robert did. Robert's stress, ironically, also came from lack of money because he tended to give away his money as fast as he made it. He was very generous, gave money to friends and family whenever they needed it. And he also had expensive habits, like a Rolls Royce, he spent it as fast. So he was always feeling stress in his middle age from money, which is ironic, but just as stressful for anybody in his profession is that, you read the reviews and sometimes they're not good. And, you have a great performance, 3 nights in a row, and then you have a dud, and that's what everybody talks about. The stress of having to be, a performer is just enormous. And I didn't even really realize that until I got into Robert's head through my mother sharing what, the things that he shared with her about how stressful it really was.
Well, I know that you've pulled this book together through, like you said, conversations with your mother and with family, personal letters, scrapbooks, all of that. But I'm kind of curious, growing up alongside Robert as your uncle, what was your impression of him growing up versus what did you discover about him as you were researching and writing that may have changed that as you were putting together this book?
Yeah, I think my first thought is to go back to what I just said. I saw him as an uncle in his middle age. And that was the impression I had of him. And then seeing him through my mother's eyes as a child, just completely different. I knew that he was generous. I didn't realize how generous. An example, when my mother said to him, I'm stuck in my career because I don't have a PhD and I can't afford to get one. He said, without missing a beat, "This is your birthday present, go get into a program." So I didn't realize just, really how generous and magnanimous he was as a person. I already knew that he was fun loving. I knew that he told amazing stories and that, you just got sucked into them. And there was something about the passion, the cadence of his voice that just drew people in. I learned more about his first, how he got the acting bug at 8 years old when a traveling troupe of troubadours or whatever they would be called, just, not A-list, probably not B-list, probably C or D-list actors, came through their little town in Orkney and he got up on stage and started hamming it up and people started laughing and that was it. He was hooked on acting. So learned a lot of things about his past that were just fascinating.
Can you talk a little bit about his journey to becoming a writer as well? Because, alongside being a very impactful actor, he was also a very skilled and talented writer, which, we'll talk about how that sort of played out for one of his most unforgettable roles in a moment. But I'm kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about his journey to writing.
Yep. Began at an early age. even back in their childhood, it began with a love of reading, I would say. The enjoyment of writing began with an enjoyment of reading. Probably that's true for all writers. And he began he I have this in the book also. When he was 6 or 7, 8 years old, my mother was 6 years old. She was a couple of years younger than him. They started visiting the local Stromness. That's the little town in Orkney where they grew up, the Stromness Library. And every Friday they would go in and get a couple more books and read the same books together so that they could discuss them. And so my mother's became, sort of his muse, as they progressed into their teenage years and later years. But when World War II began, and at this point now they're in Cornwall, and there are air raids almost every night for a good 5 years. And this is right in the heart of their teenage years. From Robert was 12 to 17 years old during that World War II period. And when the German bombers came and the sirens sounded, everybody had to turn off their lights and close the curtains. But the Shaw children, and there were 4 of them at that point, at least 4 of them that were of reading and writing age, they were all stuck in the tower. They lived in Cornwall in what's called an Oosthouse, which is a Dutch term for basically part of the beer brewing process. And an Oosthouse is used by the brewers to dry the hops. And so there's a tower where the hops are put and holes in the floors, and they would have the kilns down on the first floor, and it would waft up. But when Mrs. Shaw, my grandmother, rented that house, it was very cheap because it stank of hops. And it was all she could afford after her husband's death. So they went up into that tower, the 4 of them, and they were a very competitive group of children. And they just competed to see who could write the most interesting thing and who could read it, the most dramatically. So while the air raid sirens are going, and there's one candle in the attic and the curtains are closed, they were writing their own material and reading it to each other. And I think that's where Robert really sort of honed his writing and his performing, because as he read those things, I mean, he was a natural from an early age. So his brother and sisters were just howling with laughter. And you know what that does to a performer. They feed on that, and he fed on it all through World War II as a teenager.
And I think that sort of in no performance that I can think of does that come through more loud and clear than obviously this very powerful moment in Jaws where he recites the monologue for the USS Indianapolis. And that is arguably one of the most powerful moments in movie history, at least for me. And I gotta tell you, Chris, reading that section in your book where he gives a speech, it still gave me chills. I watch Jaws every single year for 4th of July. I just have for as long as I can remember. It's just something that I just automatically do. It's kind of like how everybody watches, the It's a Wonderful Life at Christmas. It's just one of the movies, right?
Exactly.
And I love the story, and I don't want to, for those that don't know, I don't want to spoil it too much because it does come a little later in the book, but I'd love if you could talk a little bit, as much spoiler free as you want to be about it, about how that scene sort of came together, how it was developed. And I don't think this is a spoiler, but I absolutely love what Spielberg had to say about sort of when he heard all of that. So
yeah.
Again, not to spoil anything, so you decide what you feel is spoilery and what's not. So
yeah, well, certainly for people who are big fans of Jaws, they know much of what I put in there already, right? So I don't think I'm spoiling it for the real Jaws fans. But that for me, I compare that speech to a Shakespearean soliloquy, to a Hamlet saying to be or not to be, and for the same reason. In Hamlet, for those who know the play, he does a lot of crazy things. He knows that his father, he sees the ghost and he realizes his father has been murdered. But rather than avenge him right away, he does a lot of things going, circling around the real issue, getting other people killed, innocent people, and it does a lot of stupid things. And then you hear the soliloquy and you go, oh, I get it. I get the angst that he's feeling. And, that is a moment when anybody else in that storyline in Hamlet, in this case, steps aside. And if you're on stage, the spotlight goes on that one character, and he speaks directly to the audience, and he goes, "This is what's going on inside me, so you understand." And he really, really unburdens himself. And that's what Quint did, right? And even though, that was not a stage performance, you can just see Richard Dreyfuss and Roy Scheider, per Spielberg's direction, I'm sure, take a back seat. And that spotlight went on Robert, on Quint, and he unburdened himself. And until then, he had been acting crazy, breaking the radio, burning out the engines, doing a lot of things that look suicidal. And then you hear him talk like that, and it made sense. That scene was not in the book. Wasn't part of Peter Benchley's book. Wasn't part of Peter Benchley was the first one to take a crack at writing the script, and he didn't have it in there. The idea for it was another playwright, Howard Sackler, very good playwright, and he came up with this idea. And ironically, Robert, as you mentioned, Rick, had quite a bit of writing success already, including The Man in the Glass Booth, which ran on Broadway for a year in 1968 and was nominated for a Tony Award. And do you know who won the Tony Award that year? Howard Sackler, for his play The Great White Hope, starring James Earl Jones. But this time it was Howard Sackler coming up with the idea, lots of other people trying to expand it into a Shakespearean worthy soliloquy. I may be taking some license here, comparing it to Shakespeare, right? But nevertheless, I think it certainly elevates above, a lot of other things. Nobody got it right until Robert, with a little help from a very good friend, Thornton Wilder, Pulitzer Prize winning author, but mostly Robert himself, taking what Thornton suggested, taking what John Milius, another screenwriter, had written, taking what Spielberg and Gottlieb had written their own scenes. And he put together something that elevated the scene and, I think, the movie. I mean, if there hadn't been an Indianapolis scene in Jaws, I don't know that it would, it would still be a, very interesting movie, but it would have been a horror movie. And I know this is Quills and Chills, and this is about horror, and that's why I'm here. But when you have something like the Indianapolis speech introduced into it, it takes that to another level. And I think that's part of the reason why we're still talking about it 50 years later.
It is most definitely a moment. And like I said, I feel like it's one of those like iconic moments in film and cinema history that you look at as, okay, this was something. This was not just a scene that was filmed and thrown into a sizzle reel somewhere. This is actually a very powerful like performance. And it truly, like I said, it has stuck with me all these years later. So
yeah, me too.
But beyond Jaws, I want to talk a little bit about some of his other more powerful performances, like The Sting and The Man for All Seasons and The Man in the Glass Booth. I actually have never seen that. Now I'm like, where is this play? I need to see it. So I'm gonna see if I can find the stage play to actually read.
Or it was turned into a movie as well, starring Maximilian Schell.
I did read the book though, so I want to see the stage play first. Because I read I know that there was a movie made, but I want to see the stage play version before I see the movie. So,
yeah.
And you know why.
Yes, I do. Exactly. There's something magical about the stage versus a movie. That's absolutely true.
Yeah, but I definitely wanted to. So actually, though, I want to talk about the first stage play that he wrote, which is the one that I'm very, very interested in. It's the one where I think it's the farmer that has the two prisoners of war in his basement.
Yes. Well, that was his first novel, right? But that wasn't a play. It was turned into 2 TV movies and 1 cinema movie, but it was called The Hiding Place.
Yep.
And it's maybe, arguably, for me, my favorite of his novels. And it was his first one. He wrote quite a bit after that, a lot of very good novels. And perhaps the Hiding Place was somewhat less complex than some of his later novels, which really delve deep into, the mind and the drama of individuals, but little simpler in the sense that, to your point, there, two, in this case, British, RAF pilots bail out of their airplane over Germany during World War II, are captured by a local farmer and locked in his basement for 10 years. And before you ever heard, before the term, the Stockholm syndrome ever came about, right, where the captives start to take on, the thought process of the captors, right? Robert was writing a drama about that very thing. What would it be like to be locked up for 10 years in someone's basement and to know only what that one person told them about what was going on in the outside world, which, by the way, had long let World War II go by. Germany had surrendered and Japan had surrendered, and they were still in the basement because the person who locked them there was a lonely old man who wanted them for company. And it's a fascinating premise.
I'm obsessed, and I am going to get this to actually read. So I've got this whole list now of all these different books and stage plays that I need to go and read from Robert Shaw.
He was a prolific writer. He wrote 5 novels and 3 plays, and not to mention the Indianapolis speech and other TV scripts and movie scripts.
So in preparing for our conversation today, I did go back and watch a number of Robert's interviews, especially the ones with Dick Cavett. Boy, did they have a lot of fun. But what struck me the most about him was his confidence and that intense sort of almost magnetic sort of presence that he, like you mentioned this, I think at the beginning of our conversation, like when he walked into the room or walked onto the set, you knew he was there. You knew that Robert Shaw was there, and it definitely sort of came across, and he brings a lot of that energy into his performances. I'm curious what you think sort of fueled that intensity. Where do you think that came from in him?
Well, like all of us, perhaps it came from his parents. I think first and foremost, his father, my grandfather, is somebody that I never knew. He died when Robert was 12 years old. But again, sort of listening to Robert talk about him in my childhood, and then, having my mother expand quite a bit on it when I started to interview her a few years ago about all of this. His father was a very, very charismatic man, a storyteller, a person who could do accents, Italian, French, different accents very quickly. And he must have just been the life of any party. And that was, partly his downfall, right? Because, alcohol was his downfall. And then on the flip side, so you've got this charismatic, outgoing, and basically easygoing father, right? Who never worried about his children, never worried that they were getting in trouble. In fact, encouraged them to take chances. One of his father's sayings was "better drowned than a duffer," and that's an old sort of 100-year-old British saying, which means take chances in life. You'd be better off dead than taking the safe road. So that was his father, a risk taker, and the life of the party. And then his mother, my grandmother, whom I knew very well, right? Because she died when she was like 94, 95 years old. So I had her on, she would spend many a summer with us, living in our house for 3 months during the summers. I remember taking her on a driving tour of Cornwall, where it was just her and me and a couple of other people in the car for 2 weeks, just talking, right? So she was a very stern woman, an ambitious woman. She thought that she was marrying into the upper class when she married my grandfather, because she came from the middle class. And then turns out he was lowered into a pauper's grave, and she had gone exactly the opposite way. But her ambition was transferred to her children. And she made sure that and this is something I say in the book. And in fact, I had someone, so how did your grandmother, how did Mrs. Shaw raise these 5 children in poverty And Robert went to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art and became an international movie star. His younger sister went to Oxford. My mother, the third child, went to Cambridge, and there was a doctor. The fourth one went to a prestigious medical school. The fifth one became well known all through England for her work with autism. How did Mrs. Shaw, raise these children in poverty and do this? And so someone might ask, this is one of the chapters. I'll just give it away, Rick. Well, she must have been doing homework with them every night, right? Oh, no, didn't care for that. Well, she must have read books to them every night. No, she was just totally disinterested. What she did give them was a regal bearing. She gave them what I call in the book their accent and their attitude. They spoke very, very well, very intelligently, and they consider themselves better than everybody else. And, not in a negative way, but, they didn't take a backseat to anybody ever. And that's what Robert took from his parents, the charisma of his father and the regal attitude from his mother.
I love that. I was born and raised in North Carolina, which is considered the South. And you probably have heard it a few times today. It comes and goes. But I have a Southern accent that I worked very hard to get rid of when I first arrived in California, for very much the same reasons. And so when I read that, I was like, I totally understand this. I lean more into my Southern upbringing these days than I did when I first arrived here, because again, when I first got here, they automatically assumed your IQ was equivalent to your accent in a big way. So I totally resonated with that.
Well, accents played a big role in Robert Shaw's life. I mean, when he first arrived in Orkney, he was 6 years old. He was until then, he'd been raised in England, so he had an English accent. And to somebody in Orkney, an Orcadian, that sounds snooty, and, they look down on him. Mm-hmm. But by the time they left, they had an Orkney accent, and they went to Cornwall, and the Cornish heard the Scottish, Northern Scottish Orkney accent, and they looked down on him, right? So they were constantly, having to sort of deal with people who were looking down on them because of their accents. But he went through that, 2 or 3 different times in his life, going from England to Orkney to Cornwall. And then in World War II, when they had the evacuees from London come down, now you've got, I forget what's the name of the accent in London, the Cockney. Then they had the kids with the Cockney accents come down to Cornwall. And there's another accent, altogether to deal with. And, like you said, Rick, the different perceptions. Everybody listens to an accent and they make immediate judgments on the person.
Yep, 1,000%. All right, so I have a question, but I have an answer to this question before you answer it. So I want to know if there's a particular moment in the story that you're especially excited for readers or fans of your uncle to discover. But before you answer that, I have quite a few, and I'm going to try and narrow the list down.
Okay.
So, there are quite a few. I think when he was reading The Man in the Glass Booth on set was particularly great, just to sort of see how everyone had sort of come together and just were enthralled by that. I love that. And I could totally see that in my mind. I could see that moment happening. One of the laugh out loud moments for me was the Sean Connery tuxedo moment that you talked about. I'm not going to say what it was, but it was because it's near the end of the book. It was absolutely hysterical. Yeah. I think, though, probably, and I'm not going to spoil this. You can if you want to, but I'm not going to. But you'll know what it is. But I think my absolute favorite is when he is at Patty's and he is asked to recreate a specific moment from Jaws. And I think we all thought we knew what it was, and what it turned out to be just brought such a smile and a warmth to me. I can't even tell you how much I absolutely loved it. So, that was probably equal to the Trinity College moment that came up as well. So, those are mine. Sorry, that's a long laundry list of things. But What about you? Do you have a favorite moment you're excited for people to experience?
So you just hit on a few. And you're making me chuckle just to remember them, because again, these are stories that I have chuckled at from hearing them from others before,
and I can see why.
From Robert and whatnot. And so I've just tried to capture them as best I can. Yeah, there were a lot of. I spent a lot of time, even just remembering these stories hey, Mom, what was that story Robert told us at lunch, that day after the Mike Douglas show about what happened, et cetera, et cetera. And I would just start laughing again as she's, repeated the story. So yeah, those were all good ones, Rick. I don't know that I have any one. The one that you mentioned is special to me. And that's the one where in Patty's bar, when he's surprised, he thinks they want to hear one thing and it's not that at all. And he's in a bar and I've been in Patty's bar multiple times. It's on the very West Coast, just a few miles from I guess that's the Atlantic Ocean. I'm trying to think of my geography here. The far West coast of Ireland. So that's the Atlantic Ocean. So it's just a few miles from the Atlantic, and very rural country in a small town where, the nearest town that has anything like a cinema is 40 miles away, right? So these are not the kind of people that I have grown up with, right? I grew up in Philadelphia and I live in Connecticut now. It's a very different type of setting. But Robert Shaw grew up in the Orkney Islands off the northern coast of Scotland. And the people of Orkney not only do they not think of themselves as British, they don't even think of themselves as Scottish. They're just Orcadians. They're Orkney. They're their own country in their mind. And if anybody caught the ferry to the south, to the mainland, they didn't say, they said, I'm going to Scotland. I'm traveling to Scotland, as if Scotland's another country. And then they moved to Cornwall. And Cornwall, though technically part of England, it is very similar to Orkney in the sense that Orkney's all the way to the north and Cornwall is the southernmost tip of England. And they're Celtic, basically, right? The culture is Celtic. They're very rural. And then Robert migrated to Western Ireland, also very rural, also very Celtic in terms of the culture. And these are people that do not have any airs about them. They are the exact opposite of, senior executives in a big company or studio executives or, the kinds of people that thrive on, what do you do for a living? How much money do you make? Et cetera, et cetera. They were just the opposite. They didn't care what anybody else did. They didn't care how much money anyone else made. They just wanted to have a good time and enjoy, good conversation. And so, yes, the scene in Patty's at the end of the Jaws, one of the Jaws segments, where he's surprised at what they want to hear from the movie, just shows how, that sort of simpler, less hectic way of life is something to be embraced.
It truly was. It brought such a warm feeling. It was just what a smile I had. And I was like, oh my God, I love this so much because I feel like I kind of grew up there where I grew up. And I feel like it would be the same way if I went home with.
Yeah. Okay, good. So you can appreciate it.
Totally got it. So.
Yep. That's great.
So Chris, what are you working on these days? I've been on your website. I think I saw a preview of something, but I'm going to let you tell us what's coming.
Well, I'll tell you. So I had somebody ask me once, well, are you going to do a sequel to this book? Or are you going to take some of the stories and expand them? And the answer to that is probably not. Although we'll see where things go from that perspective. I'm working on something completely different now, Rick. Not a biography, nothing about my family, but I'm about halfway through a trilogy of 3 books designed for the young adult market, sort of like a Harry Potter age reader. I think that's either middle school or YA, somewhere in that realm. And all 3 are basically a similar plot line or premise. A young boy has a father who's a successful athlete and wants to follow in his father's footsteps and is desperate to do that, but ends up with a handicap that makes it very challenging, to say the least. And I say it's a trilogy because it's going to cover 3 different parts of the world: South America, Argentina, the United States, and India. And it's going to cover the 3 sports I don't know if they're the three biggest sports in the world, but three of the biggest sports in the world. Argentina is about a boy who wants to grow up and play in the World Cup soccer like his father did. A boy in the United States wants to play baseball like his father did. And the boy in India wants to play cricket like his father did at the world level. So, like I said, I'm about halfway through that and probably have that out later this year or early next year.
I'm a big fan of YA, so I will definitely be keeping an eye out for that.
Okay.
And I do expand out from horror sometimes. So if you want to come back and talk to me about that when it's ready, I'm happy to have you. You have an open invite.
Thank you very much. I may very well take you up on that. That sounds great.
All right, perfect. All right, the book is Robert Shaw. It is an actor's life on the set of Jaws and beyond, and it is available now as of May 27th, which is my mother's birthday. So thank you very much for that. And as we always like to say here at Quills and Chills, please support your local bookstores whenever possible. So, Chris, how can our audience find you online?
So my website is www.ChristopherShawMyers, all one word.com. And my Instagram is Chris Shaw Myers, all one word, but not Christopher, Chris Shaw Myers for Instagram. That's where you'd find me online.
Perfect. We'll put those in the show notes, and for the video version, it'll be up on screen as well. So, Chris, thank you so much for talking to me today. I cannot tell you how much I enjoyed this book. It was an absolute delight to read. It's so heartwarming. It's so insightful, and just really, really gave me a very different point of view on Robert Shaw and everybody's favorite Quint. So I do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Rick. It's been a pleasure. I will come back anytime and talk to you again. I really enjoyed this.
All right, great. All right, guys, we'll see you next time on Quills and Chills. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.